They're here in box. And really, this class I gave to a very different kind of crowd, let's say, last week. And obviously it plays out differently every time. And you see that in the very beginning. Because we're going to talk about the public Menorah, but we're not going to talk about some of the typical halachic issues of the public Menorah, such as making the bracha.
What page should we have?
We're going to start on 246.
346?
246. 246. You can actually go all the way to 247.
Oh, okay.
And you see that if you look right here at this picture of a public Menorah lighting, this is in Burlington, Vermont.
Oh, that was
Now, why
Bernie Sanders.
did I stick this one in as opposed to any other one from those years in the 80s when it was starting to get big?
Bernie Sanders?
Is because of Bernie Sanders.
Oh, really?
Exactly.
No kidding.
So this is a little note that a man named Paul Burtz, who apparently is a reverend, wrote to his good friend, actually, Bernie Sanders, telling him, if you read the little black on the top left, that you should get out of this. What happened was that in the 80s, we're just getting started.
Okay.
In the 80s, when the public Menorahs were just getting big everywhere, there were a lot of lawsuits over them, as we're going to see. One of these lawsuits was in Burlington, Vermont, that in 83, the Shulchan came there for the first time, and they asked Bernie Sanders, who was the mayor there, if they can put up a menorah in front of the city hall. They didn't actually put it up there, they lit it there, and then took it home. They just had it there for that lighting and that one night. And he actually was the one to light the menorah, and he was demonstrated fluency in the brachas. But regardless of that, a couple years later, I think it was 86, they started to keep the menorah up there on the steps of the city hall all Hanukkah. And the ACLU and other groups were very unhappy about this. And they actually ended up suing the city. But Bernie Sanders fought for it until it came through the courts, and did not listen to his friends such as this one, who keeps on telling him, let's go on to other things, and are you billing Lubavitch for your legal fees for keeping up the menorah? The reason this is put into here is because some people have a very hard time with this concept. As we're going to talk in the class with some of the debate that's around it, so some Jewish people have a very hard time finding themselves on the side of the debate which might support a menorah in public, because that will also support a lot of other things that they don't want to support. So it's easier, makes it easier for them if they see that Bernie Sanders supported it.
I have a hard time with Bernie Sanders.
That's true. But for some Jews who are among his supporters or think similar to him, realizing that Bernie Sanders supported the public menorah makes it more palatable for them. In any case, it was an ongoing legal issue for many years, and there's some vestiges of it till today over these public menorahs. We'll get some of the background from the video.
Just to mention one thing. Are you familiar with the case here in Chicago?
We'll get to that.
Okay. Okay.
Proclaim liberty throughout all the land, cries a biblical verse cast into the copper and tin side of America's Liberty Bell.
Why is it cracked?
What better spot to celebrate Hanukkah? The commemoration of ancient Jewry's liberation from religious oppression. The symbolism was not lost on Rabbi Shem Tov, Chabad's senior emissary to Philadelphia, who made Liberty Bell the scene of the nation's first public menorah lighting. That was Hanukkah of 1974, and Rabbi Shem Tov heeded the revolutionary call issued a year earlier by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who had urged his followers to take Hanukkah rituals to families, streets, and cities across the nation, in a bold campaign to awaken a largely assimilated American Jewry to their rich heritage. But it was Rabbi Drizzen, Chabad's emissary to San Francisco, who in 1975 introduced America's first giant menorah in a public venue. That year, the 9-foot statue of an ancient Greek deity of victory that towers over San Francisco's Union Square was rivaled by a 25-foot, 8-branch symbol of Jewish victory over the ancient Greeks. Over 1,000 Jews showed up, and the idea of celebrating Hanukkah en masse via giant public menorahs caught on at the speed of light, spreading to malls, parks, squares, and hundreds of locations worldwide, and inspiring endless creativity. While the menorah events were popular with the Jewish rank and file, the initiative ignited a furious debate among some of the Jewish leadership, threatening to douse the public Hanukkah flame altogether. The Jewish American community soon found itself deeply divided. In particular, Chabad was accused of undermining the principle of the separation of church and state by placing a religious symbol in a public venue.
The clause in the First Amendment that dealt with no establishment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, and they said that means no state religion or state involvement in religion. Now we saw a shift, and people said, wait a minute, there's also another clause, and that clause says, prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
The menorah was dragged from one courtroom to the next and was struck down in cities in Vermont, Chicago, Iowa, Georgia, New York, and elsewhere, while being simultaneously upheld in other localities.
This is a Chabad
Nat
video?
Lewin, one of America's foremost
With a menorah
attorneys,
shaped like
was
that?
the star of the legal struggle in
Like that?
support of the public menorah.
To send them a complaint.
Well, the legal challenges really began in 1987 and 88, when the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, the American Jewish Congress, the American Jewish Committee, and various other civil liberties organizations decided that they were going to challenge the menorah being put up.
It quickly became clear that the Hanukkah display disproportionately upset Jewish rather than non-Jewish Americans.
Of course.
It was a major disaster
not
if we
surprised.
came before a Jewish judge, because the Jewish judges ruled against the menorah.
Chabad's public menorah even cast its glow in the United States Supreme Court. In 1989, the United States Supreme Court ruled in favor of Chabad in the county of Allegheny against the ACLU. And in 2002, it ruled in favor of Chabad in southern Ohio against the city of Cincinnati, allowing an 18-foot menorah in Fountain Square. The public menorah has become standard fare in many cities, and it is lit annually on the White House lawn and within the White House as well. But the debate has far from subsided.
And I continue to get, every Hanukkah, I get 2, 3, or even more requests from local Chabad shluchim who tell me that the local authorities have been persuaded by some local organization that they should not allow the menorah to go up.
Some 4 decades has elapsed since the famously cracked Liberty Bell first met its menorah neighbor. The argument still persists as to whether the public menorah is a threatening crack in our nation's liberty. But what is so threatening about a menorah proclaiming the festival of light on a street corner? Could there be more to this debate?
So judging by the reactions to the video, it's going to be a very different class than it was for me last time. We had some serious challengers to some of the ideas, particularly have an older individual who was a retired attorney, but he was actually a retired civil rights attorney, who once argued in Supreme Court himself, but he was very disturbed by this entire idea of having the menorahs in public places and the separation of church and state. And he gave me a hard time, but he was okay in the end. So I'll go through some of this discussion. I'm not an expert on the Constitution, and therefore we won't claim to be, but nevertheless, just to understand what was the legal issue that was going on. Well, we're mostly familiar with the term of wall of separation, which on constitutional law creates a separation between the state and any government institution really, and religion. This term is not in the Constitution or in any of the amendments. This term was written by Thomas Jefferson some 12 or so years after the First Amendment was adopted in his letter to some Christian organization, where he explains the thinking behind the First Amendment. And he explains that the idea was to create a wall of separation, to create separation between church and the state in order to preserve the freedom of everyone to do as they pleased when it comes to religion. What does the First Amendment actually say? So this is the relevant clause from that amendment, which actually is read as two sometimes competing clauses. The first one, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, is known popularly as the Establishment Clause, is very straightforward, saying that there should be no Congress, and later by the power of the 14th Amendment, the states cannot do anything which would establish a religion. So you can't require people to be religious in any way, nor give any preference to a specific religion which would establish that religion as the state religion as was common in Europe before the establishment of the United States. So the Establishment Clause is there to prohibit establishing any specific religion or really any religion at all. The next clause, known as the Free Exercise Clause, is almost the other side of the coin, where we say that it's prohibited that the Congress is not able to prohibit the free exercise of any religion. So just as they can't establish Christianity or any of its specific forms as the religion of the United States, they're also not able to prevent anybody from following any specific religion, including, of course, for us, Judaism. What happens is that once in a while, these two clauses get into trouble somewhat with each other. Now, to take an easier example, it's been settled, really. But when you come to discuss, for example, a specific type of funding, let's say funding for busing or transportation for private schools, is it legal for the government to fund transportation for private schools, which would include religious schools? Or are they supporting a religion which violates the Establishment Clause? Anyone?
Well, Cheder has buses.
So the Cheder gets government funding for buses, so it must be okay somehow.
Yeah.
And actually,
Why would that be preferencing a single religion?
They're not,
we're
right?
not preferencing a single religion, but the absolutionists, let's say, read the first clause to say that the government cannot do anything in any direction religious. And the distinction you're making is exactly the point, where the law actually, the Supreme Court actually established, I think it's already in the 40s, that giving support to all the private schools equally would not violate this clause, even though technically they're giving money to a religious organization with a religious purpose.
Yeah, but the
Sometimes
money's
schools
coming
touch
from us. Like we pay, real estate taxes, whatever. It goes to public schools. There should be no reason why it shouldn't be able to support us
I
too.
would say on the contrary, by supporting only public schools, you're
Right.
supporting the anti-religious.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
Because
these
you're then limiting,
maybe-
you're not paying per child, you're paying for only those that are not in a religious
Right.
school.
Let's break that down.
Maybe
though,
that's why
before
they-
that point, to another point, which is if they were to fund busing or any other specific detail for private schools, but only fund secular private schools, then they would actually be discriminating against religious schools.
Right.
So if they only funded the public schools, they always have the argument that we don't fund the non-government institutions. But if they're funding private institutions, then to not fund the religious ones is actually discriminating against religion and therefore somewhat a violation of free exercise. This principle is somewhat the same as what got the Menorah up at Daily Plaza. So if you read this, it's JTA from 1988, and thanks to Rabbi Moskowitz for referring us all to this article. So, as you read just in the very beginning, the 18-foot menorah being lit in Chicago's Daily Plaza shines its light by the grace of a preliminary court order handed down by U.S. District Court Judge James Parsons last month. To deny them such use of Daily Plaza merely because they are religious organizations seeking to make religious expression is discrimination in its rankest form. It goes against every grain of Americanism, Parsons said. So, if other people can use Daily Plaza to protest or march for women's rights or veganism, or whichever cause is close to their hearts, then to not allow religious organizations to use the same plaza for their own expression is actually discrimination. So taking the establishment clause that far to say that everybody can use this place or this tool or this funding besides for religions actually becomes discrimination. This is what got the Menorahs through in many places. In fact, if we saw Nat Lewin mention that in the video, that he keeps getting requests each year for legal issues with Menorahs, his first question always is, what else happens in that spot? What else happens in that location where the Menorah is going to be going up? If there's other stuff going on, then he can fight for it. Whereas if the city or village or state governing that public spot doesn't rent it out or doesn't allow groups to use it for private purposes, then it's going to be more challenging.
How does the ruling of the Supreme Court in 1988, I think he said, in Vermont, how does that affect other cities and states and things like?
So the ruling of the Supreme Court was in 1989 regarding the Menorah in Pittsburgh, and it's a very complicated ruling to say the least. It had 5 different opinions.
What?
There's 2 cases that are merged into one because the groups, the liberal groups, shall we say, sued against both the city of Pittsburgh and the county, because the city of Pittsburgh was allowing the menorah to go up next to the tree in front of the city hall, and the county had a Christian display. Won't go into all the details, but you can imagine it was the full-fledged religious display with a message written on the bottom about the holiday and the birth of the Savior on the steps of the county courthouse. And they were both sued, and when the Supreme Court took the case, they took them both as one. And also Chabad was allowed to join the case to defend its menorah. Ultimately, the court ruled 6-3 that the menorah could stay, and 5-4 that the Christian display had to go down.
Wow.
So the menorah was allowed up as a complicated reasoning, shall we say, which says that yes, the menorah is a religious symbol, but there's no other symbol for Hanukkah. So if the tree can be there because it's a cultural symbol for the end of year holidays, then the Jews should also be able to celebrate their culture independent of religion. And there's no non-religious symbol for Hanukkah, so we'll let them use the religious symbol to do that.
It's not as a religious expression.
That was the
So it's not really, they didn't win. They didn't really win.
Because in America, a tree is not considered a religious symbol when we know it.
Yes, but
And that was argued by Gershom Sternberg, the attorney who I know for Chabad. He went to the Rabbi with his brief, and he told them, just go ahead with the case. The American Jewish Congress, of course, Reformed Jews, who also gave us problem in Evanston to open up, are the ones who forced the issue. And then at the bottom, a survivor gave $100,000 to overcome the court's wish to prevent a lawsuit by the American Jewish Congress. So that was how it played out in
the question I'm asking is if there's a ruling of the Supreme Court in favor of the menorah, doesn't that then set precedent that all menorahs?
Yeah, well, that's the idea I'm trying to get to. That essentially, the menorah was allowed, but there was not a very direct ruling about the menorah itself. So let's say there's a menorah with no tree, because the city put it up. Let's say they mention Hanukkah in some other way. And there's continued to be other cases. Nat Lewin went back to the Supreme Court when cities refused to allow it, to force them to allow it because of freedom of expression. So that he also won. But it can't actually be applied to each situation equally. So what he typically does is writes a letter explaining the background of the litigation in the various courts he was in the Supreme Court and around the country, hoping that the particular village will just let it go at that point, and they usually do. But technically, some of the menorahs can probably still be challenged based on whether there's a tree there, based on whatever else is going on there, etc., etc. Now, being that we're not here to discuss the Constitution, we're going to shift the discussion to a more Jewish discussion. And ultimately, as emerges from this case and from the more than 60 religion cases that there were over this principle in the Supreme Court, that it's an open question to some degree, how much is the government allowed to fund something religious or allow something religious to take place in public property, etc. And if it's an open and ongoing constitutional discussion, so what side should the Jews be on? What's good for the Jews? Well, we know that it was a debate between all these other Jewish groups and Chabad. And if we go back to the root of the debate, we might be able to break it down to a question over what's the bigger threat to Judaism and to Jewish identity. One perspective is to say that the other religions are the greater threat. So, if we want to survive as Jews and with Yiddishkeit in a society where we're overwhelmed many times over, we're an extreme minority, the one view says other religions challenge our religion and make it hard for us to practice our religion freely. Whereas the other perspective is to say no. Yes, other religions can be a challenge and they've been in history, but being secular and irreligious is a greater threat. So what's better for us, for society to be? Do we want society to be religious, even though we understand that their religion will not be ours? Is that better for our survival as Jews?
Yes.
Or do we want society to be secular, so that they don't get involved in any other religions and shove their religion down our back, and we'll be have an easier time surviving as Jews that way? So this is the discussion really that we have to have, and I would suggest taking the book to look at the first couple texts, which are actually Torah texts for a change. And the challenge in these books is that you need to realize which texts are Torah and which texts are not. And they have a little scroll right after the source when it's a Torah text.
Okay.
Page 247. Page 247 will give you the first text here. My hint for you will be that I really did not like these first two texts. I think they don't belong in this class. But nevertheless, we'll start with them. The first is the Gemara in Megilla, Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. So that's text 3a on page 247, where the Gemara asks why Mordechai was called a Yehudi. Mordechai was from the Shevet, the tribe of Binyamin. He was not a Yehudi. He was not from the tribe of Yehuda. Why do we keep calling him a Yehudi? Now, of course, technically, you can call any Jew at that time a Yehudi, which is now the term for Jew, because they're members of the kingdom of Judea, because the tribe of Yehuda ruled over both Yehuda and Binyamin, which was the only surviving element of Eretz Yisrael at the time. So Mordechai was a Yehudi that way. But the Gemara still wants to know more than that. Why are we calling someone from the tribe of Binyamin by the name Judean, a member of the tribe of Yehuda? The Gemara explains that, and I'm going to read it in the English. Why was Mordechai called the Jew? Because he repudiated idolatry. For anyone who repudiates idolatry is called Yehudi Jew. And it is written, there are these Jews whom you have appointed of the affairs of the province of Babylonia. They serve not your God, nor worship the golden image that you have erected. So Yehuda, the original term Yehuda we had in the Parsha just 2 weeks ago, comes from the term Hapam Oide. Now I will think, I will recognize, I will confess really before Hashem. So Yehuda means to submit to Hashem's authority. So being a Yehudi, a member of Yehuda, is anyone who rejects idol worship and submits to the authority of the one and only God, Hashem. That's why Mordechai was called a Yehudi. Similar concept emerges from the next text, which is a medrash in Sifri and Devarim, where we say that anyone who accepts idolatry is considered to have repudiated the entire Torah, and anyone who repudiates idolatry is considered to have accepted the entire Torah. So,
Isn't it
Repudiated.
see, that's why I have to come here. Nobody corrected me last time.
Repudiated.
So actually I didn't read it last time. I gave the crowd to read it. That's why.
Repudiate, yeah. Okay.
So, the
That's right, you went to Cheder.
the message we're getting so far is that being a Jew and rejecting any other type of religion and avodah zarah is very strongly connected. Being a Jew is someone who rejects avodah zarah. Does this have any bearing on our debate?
Yes.
Please explain.
Well, on this question, Team A or Team B,
Yeah.
that means we would go under Team A.
So, reading these texts, we would say that other religions are a bigger problem. If they're secular, we ignore them.
Depends whether you count them as being avodah zarah.
Okay, that's a great point. Let's assume, for argument's sake, that avodah zarah just means foreign worship, any type of worship outside of Judaism, and then we'll get back to that point later. So,
Oh, I see what you're saying.
if you
You're saying
Supports Team B.
explain,
Because the lack, not believing, it would be Team B would just say that heresy, someone that doesn't believe in any God, would be much further away from anything religious. Someone that automatically believes in a God, whether it's through different means than Judaism, that already defines them as much more similar.
okay, so we're going to get also onto that point, but I think from reading these texts, it's either irrelevant to our discussion, which is actually correct reading, or if you want to find the relevance, it supports saying that we don't want more Christianity because it's avodah zarah in some form, and we want less avodah zarah because we're Yehudi.
Based on the story of Napoleon and the Alter Rebbe, I would say that pose of other religions is better than no religion.
That's correct, but you're not getting that from this reading.
No.
Right. So, in my very humble opinion, or not so humble, you could say that a Jew is someone who rejects avodah zarah, but that has nothing to do with this discussion. Yes, to be Jewish, you need to reject avodah zarah. If you don't reject avodah zarah, you have a problem. But what does that say about our view of what society should be? We still don't know if we prefer society to be religious or secular, which of course they won't be Jewish. They're either going to be religious Christians or Buddhists or something else, or they'll be secular. Which is better from our perspective?
We want them to have the right to worship what they do.
Right, but do we prefer that society should be more religious or less religious? Of course, we want the right to be open, otherwise we won't have it either.
I would say
I'll tell you, my personal experience traveling a lot and being in Ashgacha is I get stopped by American Christians all the time at gas stations, and they just walk up to me just because of how I look, and they say, "We support your country of Israel, and God bless you," and they just shower me with blessings. So
religious people are more prone to be supportive. They're not religious people. That's your point.
Yeah, that's my experience.
Now, if you look at figure 6.1, which is too long for us to read and not really necessary.
I'm like learning Tanakh in the car with like my Uber driver. He's like Indian. He's like fascinated by it.
right.
Going to have a mitzvah to learn Pshat in Tanakh.
Well, we're going into whether they have a mitzvah or not, but they're not. It's not usher for a guy to
It's
learn.
not usher. Okay,
to
fine.
learn
Not
Torah
necessarily a
Shabbat.
mitzvah, but it's not usher.
The whole Torah itself.
I believe so.
And Rashi, according to the Divine Code by Moshe Weinberg, or what's his name?
On figure 6.1 on page 249, you have a long list of anti-Semitic history. But what's unique about this list is that it's not there to tell us the history of anti-Semitism, which would take books and many more. It's there to point out instances of religiously motivated persecution, where the persecution is there based on religion.
Yeah.
They're here because they want us to subscribe to their religion, and therefore they're persecuting us. And therefore you can debate whether Purim and Hanukkah belonged in there, but for some reason they did put it there. But nevertheless, if you start from like the first century, you have numerous instances of both major religions persecuting Jews and offering them the choice of either joining our religion or leaving this world. So it seems that religion was a major motivation and driving force behind the persecution of Jews for almost 2,000 years. And if people would be less religious, maybe they would be less intolerant of our religion.
Well, the question is, did they also try to persecute people who were irreligious and try to get them to join their religions also?
Right, but that was because the persecutors, in this case the states and the state-affiliated church, were religious.
But that's not the question. The question is Jewish identity. It's not numbers of survivors.
But we won't be Jewish identity if we don't make it. So yes, well, the discussion is surviving as Jews, but if they force us to convert, Jewish identity took a huge drop in Spain and Portugal because of forced conversion. So the two go together. If they're persecuting us, then the Jewish identity is reduced in a very similar way to the way it's lost to assimilation. And this figure 6.1, this idea of most of the persecution having been religiously motivated, is really the thinking of these other Jewish organizations who were suing Chabad and the municipalities over the Menorah. Because they felt that the freedom of the Jewish people in the United States was because there's separation of church and state. So people can be as religious as they want, but they're not going to bother our religion because the state and the government bodies are irreligious. And they took it to the extent of feeling that other religions are the greater threat. Let's have society be as less religious as possible and as secular as possible, so they don't bother us. So they're not motivated to get us to join them. This was their thinking. They took it to the extreme and they fought for it really hard.
And that's why we have what we have, so we have to thank them.
So yes, if you go back to the beginning of history...
Persecution makes us strong, unfortunately.
All right, I thought you meant a different point. But if you do go back to the beginning of the American history, there was still discrimination between religions. And it took a long time for these principles of the Constitution, the amendments, to settle in. And Jews were among those fighting for it. But those same Jewish successors to the same Jewish organizations today continue to believe that we need to continue fighting for secularization, really, of society in order that our religion isn't threatened by theirs. So they do feel that any instance of too much religion in society will cause that religion to try to overwhelm ours. And take that to the extent of if the government's going to fund a private school, even if they fund them all equally, well then they're getting involved in something religious, who knows what's going to happen next. Does anybody agree with this thinking? Or have anything to add or...
Could you repeat it again?
Yeah.
And it's a little challenging for me because it's not my own thinking. But nevertheless, if you read some of the text, we have some of it in the back, and it goes back to Lilienthal, the same Haskalah guys from Germany who were fighting with the Tzemach Tzedek when then came to the United States. They laid down, they said, this is going to be our iron clause, separation of church and state. And they fought for it aggressively. And they felt that any time that usually it's Christianity, but any religion becomes dominant in society, they will automatically develop to persecuting the minority religions. And they felt and continue to feel that the only way to secure Jews in the United States, and I guess in their thinking in any country, is to separate religion from the state, so that the state does not take any stand on religion and doesn't care if we're Jewish or if we're frum or anything of the sort.
But this is going on in Eretz Israel between the frum and non-frum people. It's not just the goyim; it's us ourselves.
Okay.
Yeah, but if you look deeply into these people, it wasn't just separation of church and state. They themselves were against religion. Bichlal.
Okay, well, we have to get to that, and we will. We have to get to that.
To separate church and state in order that the population can observe the way they want freely.
Yes.
Yeah, that would be nice.
So it turned out, interestingly, that for most of American history, Christian groups were fighting for less separation because they wanted funding, they wanted rights for something in the public sphere, while Jewish groups, although they were technically religious groups, were fighting for more separation because they felt that if there's less separation, it's going to be stacked against us. And that may have been true some time ago, but it is no longer true. And this is the real crux of it here, and we'll get to this in the statements the Rebbe makes about this. But if you look around the world outside the United States, Jews have freedom in other countries as well. And the separation of church and state exists only here. The United Kingdom...
You don't have freedom in Turkey, for example? they cannot live in a very young country.
But that's because Turkey is not democratic.
Yeah, we're not talking
Not
about
because they don't have separation. The United Kingdom is a religious country essentially, and the Church of England and the monarchy are one and the same. Nevertheless, there's religious freedom because they're democratic. Even in Canada, there's no separation of church and state as a cardinal rule, and therefore there can be funding for religious institutions in some instances. But as a democratic society, they allow everyone to do as they wish.
So
In Germany, when I was there, I mean, it goes on until today, every town had the property of the shul was built on government property. They would assign property to the churches, lahavdil, and to the shuls. But they were secular as a government, and there was minorities who could practice their religion as much as they wish.
But in a way, it doesn't make sense.
Explain.
For example, first of all, in Torah we have a forced conversion. Okay? If somebody live in our land, historically we have to convert into Judaism.
I'm not familiar with this halacha.
Okay, if somebody live in our land.
If somebody lives in our land, he's required to accept the Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach. He's not required to convert to Judaism. He should not convert to Judaism just for living in our
Right,
land.
but we're not practicing Christianity. If they accept,
Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach, we'll get to whether they could practice Christianity, but they don't have to practice Judaism.
well, it's kind of practicing Judaism, giving the soul.
It's just about living as people the way that we believe is appropriate for all people to live,
Right.
without being
But
Jewish.
the way we believe.
Well,
the way they
if
believe.
you want to come to the United States, you have to accept the United States Constitution, which is the way they believe it's correct to live.
But this constitution is very fluid, so it can be changed tomorrow.
Fine, so we're not so flexible. We stick to our principles, unlike the Constitution, thank God. But that doesn't mean that we're asking them to be religious. But I do want to go back to the core debate here, which is in a sense more important than the Menorah or not. Whether other religions are the greater threat, or being secular and irreligious is the greater threat. And if you skip, because we really covered the ideas of the next text, to 6b, or 6a really for starters, on page 256, we start to get to the idea, which was already mentioned here, about which of the two are really more important. So in 6a is the beginning of the Asaras HaDibros. Hashem spoke all these words saying, I am God, your God, who took us out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall not have other gods in my presence. So the first of the Asaras HaDibros is that there should be no other God. There should be only belief in Hashem. The second is no one else. So we're first commanded to believe in the one God, and then we're reminded and exhorted not to worship idols. Now that sequence is important. The Ibn Ezra points this out, 6b on page 257. The first commandment is the foundation upon which all the mitzvahs are built. After that comes the command, you shall not have. The corruption of one who does not believe in God is greater than the corruption of one who worships idols. As the idol worshippers also believe in God, only they incorporate others with Him. So, which is better at this point? Based on the Ibn Ezra. Is it better for society to be secular or to be religious with a religion other than our own?
You could say that Ibn Ezra means is referring to Christianity, but not Hinduism and all these other things.
Okay, so we'll get back to that. But let's assume for a second.
Someone doesn't believe in God, it's more dangerous. Someone doesn't, it's like the silence in the schools for 1 minute.
Right.
So if no one says there's no major being, that's the most dangerous.
Exactly, and this is what the Ibn Ezra points out, that Hashem said first, believe in me as one God, and then He talked about not worshiping idols. Because firstly, believe that there's a supreme being, believe there's someone more powerful than yourself. Otherwise, you're on the road to chaos. Then, we'll get down to the details of it. So this automatically establishes for us, for anyone who accepts the Torah text as fact, which wasn't the case, of course, in my previous class, that the greater threat is irreligiosity. And let's see the Rebbe use this point back in the context of the constitutional debate. If you look at text 7 on page 258, it's a little long, but it's a quick read. The Rebbe says in Likutei Sichos, there's a proposal that the government should provide financial support to Talmud Torahs and yeshivas. But as always, there are those who are trying to counteract this support and prevent the Torah learning of Jewish children, God forbid. They argue that such support is against the Constitution. This is a strange argument, for even one who believes the Constitution should take precedence over the Torah learning of Jewish children, and that no effort should be made to amend it in this regard, would certainly agree that if the government, which certainly knows what the Constitution says, agrees to provide this support, there's no conflict here. Is it their task to instruct the Supreme Court of the United States on constitutional law? So the Rebbe really takes issue with a lot of these Jewish organizations and said, this is not your business. As Jews, our job is to promote Yiddishkeit, or at the very least, the core values of Yiddishkeit, and to promote the Torah's message. We're not here to support the Constitution. We have to follow the Constitution for technical reasons. If the government and the Supreme Court are willing to let us have some certain support of religion, and they're not bothered by it being against the Constitution, should we as Jewish organizations come and remind them or fight for a certain reading of the Constitution, which would undermine this support?
Good point.
So the Rebbe actually makes this point in a letter to Dr. Glazer, who we'll see later, who was a Reform rabbi and the vice president of the Central Reform Rabbinic Body.
Are you going to finish reading this, Sicha?
Yes.
Okay.
Where the Rebbe says, where he wrote to the Rebbe against the public Menorahs, and he complains that it's against the Constitution, and the Rebbe tells him that the keepers of the Constitution, meaning the government bodies, are fine with it. So he responds, reminding the Rebbe that the government bodies are not there to keep the Constitution. Only the Supreme Court is defining and establishing constitutional law. But he missed the point. The point is that we are not here to uphold constitutional law. We are here to support Yiddishkeit. And we follow the Constitution as the law of the land. We're not here to instruct Congress or the Supreme Court and to file briefs that they should take a stricter reading of the Constitution, which might hurt Yiddishkeit, in this case, the Torah study of Jewish children. Let's move on to the next argument which was made against this support, which is a little more directly related to this part of the debate. They also argued that if Jewish schools receive this support, then Christian schools will receive it as well, with the result that one will be causing the strengthening of Avodah Zarah, which is forbidden to non-Jews under the Noahide laws commanded by Hashem to all of humanity. Therefore, it is forbidden by Jewish law for Jews to accept this financial support under the principle, do not place a stumbling block before the blind. So if it's forbidden for a non-Jew to be Christian, then it's forbidden for us to cause them to be Christian, even indirectly. So therefore, we shouldn't be taking government support for schools so that they shouldn't get government support and be more Christian. Now, we don't really need to get into this point, but just to clarify, the Rebbe mentions this in the skip part of the Sikha. Christianity is not necessarily a forbidden idol worship for non-Jews, because according to the Ramah at least, so according to most Haiskim today, Christianity is what we would call shituf, where they believe in one God, but they also ascribe powers to some other beings as God's assistants, which is forbidden for us as a form of Avodah Zarah, but it's not necessarily forbidden under the Sheva Mitzvahs that also the Goyim must follow. So for them to be Hindus is outright forbidden. We need to convince them out of it. But we're not necessarily obligated to convince them out of being Christian, even if they're Catholics, because that can be taken as shituf, where they have one God and his assistants, as opposed to multiple gods, which may not be forbidden for them. But the Rebbe says, regardless, even if you believe that it's absolute Avodah Zarah, or you hold according to the Rambam, which the Christians are a forbidden form of Avodah Zarah, in his opinion. Therefore, he would say that it's forbidden to do business with them on Sundays, because that would support their worship. Although today, again, most places can believe that the Christians are not believers, they're just cultural. But that's another discussion. In any case, we don't follow the Rambam in this regard. But even if you do believe that it's idol worship and it's a problem according to the seven mitzvahs, nevertheless, we wouldn't have a problem of causing them indirectly to get government support. Why? So the Rebbe continues to make the point. In public schools, many of the subjects are taught in a way that both directly and indirectly causes a student to conclude that the world has no master, which is a small step from completely denying the existence of the creator of the world. Such denial is certainly a violation of the Noahide laws according to all opinion, It may in fact be preferable that non-Jewish children are educated in their Christian schools rather than in public schools. As is known, a complete heretic is worse than an idol worshiper, as we already mentioned. So, you're complaining of the side effect. The side effect is that Christian schools will get more support. Who said that side effect is bad? Maybe that side effect is good. Because when they go to secular school, where the message is given in a totally secular way, their takeaway, the children's takeaway is that it all boils down to the science or to the human understanding. Although the teachers don't make the argument for or against religion, by omitting any mention of God from anything, the impression is made upon the child that there's no God relevant to the discussion. It's all about the secular and scientific understanding. And this is how you develop an irreligious society, which is how we get to, unfortunately, where we got to today. This is, as we mentioned earlier, why the Rebbe pushed so hard for a moment of silence or other forms of recognition of a higher authority, even in public schools. So here the Rebbe says, look, we're not going to fund Christian schools. We're not giving them donations. But if for the government to give us money will cause them to also give money to Christians, maybe that's better. Maybe that side effect is actually a good side effect, that they'll actually believe in some form of a God as opposed to nothing. We really are not doing what this lesson is designed to do, which is to debate this, because I think most people agree. But nevertheless, if we go to text 8b, I think it's fascinating, and it brings home the Rebbe's point of the importance of having some belief in a God in a different way, a very interesting way. This is written by a man named Pinchas Biberfeld. I remember when Rabbi Yochanan Wasserman, may God avenge his blood, Yochanan Wasserman was killed by the Nazis, visited Berlin and spoke at our rabbinical seminary. His visit was in the week of in which the Parsha of Vayera is read, and he expounded on Avram's word to Avimelech, only there's no fear of God in this place and they will kill me. So he talked about why he hid Sarah's identity as his wife. And he said, I recognize that Ein Yiras Elikim B'Makam Hazeh, there's no fear of God in this place, and therefore they're going to kill me. So Elchanan Wasserman read this about Berlin. The illusion was clear. Berlin may be a center of science and culture, but if there's no fear of heaven, one should fear for one's life. This was in the first years of the Nazi regime, in 1935 or 36, and people had no inkling yet of where Germany was headed. I remember being personally insulted by the words of this tzaddik of the generation. I thought to myself, a great sage and rabbi comes from Eastern Europe to tell us that here in this civilized and enlightened country, human beings will be murdered with impunity? How is this possible? It is not a country in which the rule of law prevails, but his sage eyes saw into the near future much better than my younger years.
This is Biberfeld writing this?
Sorry? Yeah.
Yes.
About,
he writes about his experience with Rabbi Yochanan Wasserman, where he says he came to Germany and he sniffed the place up and says, this is a place where Ein Yiras Elikim, there's no fear of God. Watch for your life.
Yep.
And that's exactly what happened. This is, of course, the Rebbe's prime example for how critical it is to there be some belief in God, or even if it's going to be another religion, because look where they end up when it's not there.
It is just strange because historically we saw this timeline of the number of persecutions that there have been in religious countries against Jews because they tried to convert us or they want us to stop being Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
But nowadays we have a secular country and now we're going to say, well, it's not religious enough. We want to go back the other way again. Or Germany was too secular. We wished it was religious. So it's sort of like, which do we really want it to be? It's kind of both or it's kind of neither, or it's kind of like we reach the point after a long world history that finally there became like a secular country, which was like unheard of, like unprecedented. America changed the whole world. Now America like owns the world, and like secularism and Westernism and capitalism owns the world. But like now it's like we want it to be religious again. But now maybe it's a better, now that there is secularism, now it's like a better breeding ground for religion because there's already this freedom of expression sort of attitude where it's not going to become like blood libel again.
Okay, well let's break this down to 2 points. Firstly, the history supports the argument that the other religions will be the persecution because they were religious throughout most of history. We don't have enough case studies in secular regimes. We do, however, have 2 from the last century, and they were possibly worse than the 2,000 years of Christian rule beforehand. That's both the Nazi society and the communists were both secular, and they created such destruction for Jews and Judaism that all the Inquisitions together couldn't do.
Right, worse than ever.
So that's our small example, shall we say, from a little bit of history where societies finally became secular. They weren't any better. And look in the United States today, it gets more secular, and also if you go to any campus, more anti-Jewish in the very secular and very liberal forefront, shall we say, of society.
Yeah.
But not the forefathers of America. They were very much into God. They put
That's
it on
part of the
bill,
Rebbe's
they put
argument,
it on there, right.
that their
Constitution
message.
was all godly.
The message of freedom of religion came from religious people.
Right.
So the Rebbe's argument is that they were there for freedom of religion, not freedom from religion.
Yes.
They wanted everyone to be able to be religious as they wished to, not that nobody should be religious.
Yes.
And so, if you arguably they are turning over in their graves today, where bakers could be forced to violate their religion because of discrimination. And this,
Bakers.
Yeah.
Bakeries,
They have to make a cake of two guys getting married.
well, the case is ongoing, but this is exactly what the Rebbe is arguing. The
They say
secularism.
they would go nuts if they saw that they.
Yeah.
It's old by now.
That bakers are forced to.
It's not old by now. It's in Supreme Court right now.
5
Two
years
guys.
ago.
It's,
really?
It was argued last week in the Supreme Court, the day after I gave this class.
And what's
And my class attorney was filling me in on the details.
Give your tefillos for the baker.
The real problem is not the verdict. I don't know what the verdict is going to be. But the argument the baker uses is not for freedom of religion. It's for freedom of expression. And he's trying to make an argument that he's an artist and his cakes are a form of speech, and therefore his free speech is being violated. He's not even trying to get through on it's violating his religion because his lawyers don't expect it to win. So you see where society and the Supreme Court have ended up.
They say that the cake is stale by now.
It's in the freezer.
They still want it, even if it's stale.
So, as a closing argument on this particular point, and this responds also to what you're saying, is text 9 on page 267. This is the Rebbe's core argument. Some would argue this is part of a much longer letter from the Rebbe about non-denominational prayer in public schools and other forms of religion or belief in God in public that the Rebbe tried to advocate. Some would argue that the principle of separation of state and church must be maintained at all costs in order to prevent the resurgence of religious persecution so prevalent in the Middle Ages when established state religion denied equal or any rights to other religions, etc. So some, and this is what the other Jewish organizations are there doing, to fight for the separation of state and church to the extreme. The fallacy of this argument should be quite obvious. By way of illustration, suppose a person was ill at one time and doctors prescribed certain medication and treatment. Suppose that years later the same person became ill again, but with an entirely different, in fact quite contrary malady. Wouldn't it be reasonable to recommend the same medication and treatment as formerly? In medieval times, the world suffered from an excess of religious zeal and intolerance. In our day, the world is suffering from excessive indifference to religion, or even from a growing materialism and atheism. So to apply the solution that the Constitution needed
That's what I was saying.
against religious persecution 200-300 years ago doesn't apply today. Exactly. Today, the problem is they're too secular. So let's deal with today's issue. And instead of seeing any form of God in public as a threat to the separation, we should probably see that as a solution to the excessive secularism. This winds up this part of the discussion where we went through really 3 points, which in my opinion are really 2. One was to say that since idolatry is the antithesis of Judaism, so therefore we should just advocate for secularism, but we responded to that the belief in a higher authority is more important than making sure they're not idol worshippers. Then we talked about religiously motivated persecution, but we found out that secular regimes weren't any better. Or if you just don't go all the way to persecution, but the pressure and the overwhelming religious society puts on us, well, the secular societies and secular humanism that we're seeing today is not making things any better.
Kills more Jews.
Sorry?
Kills more Jews.
It kills more Jews, ultimately, yes. So America's not up to there yet, but it does
Secular
ultimately...
humanism. They assimilate and they
Well,
intermarry.
that's what I said. That was the Rebbe with Napoleon. That was his.
That was exactly the issue with the Alter Rebbe had with Napoleon.
Yeah.
That he was secular and atheistic. He rathered the Tsar. But here we move on to another question beyond our opinion for general society. So now we know that we prefer general society to be more religious. So we want to fight for menorahs in the public sphere, and we don't care if they'll put Christian symbols in the public sphere because that might actually have an advantage. But we do want to put the menorah there even at that cost, which may not be a cost. But now we move on to another argument.
What do you mean it may not be a cost?
There may not be a loss, it might be a benefit.
For them being religious.
Yeah. Now, if we go to text 10, on page 268, this is a non-Torah text. This is part of a letter from this Joseph Glazer, who, interestingly enough, the Rebbe in his responses to him, and you could read them in the appendix here, did not call him a rabbi. He wrote him as doctor, and he had a number of degrees, so he had the title doctor. But the publishers of this book believed that it was okay to call him rabbi, even though he's a Reform rabbi. Some Rabbanim today, at least, if you ask them, will allow you to call a Reform rabbi the title rabbi, because they treat it just as a title like doctor or any other professional title. But the Rebbe was obviously more careful than that and didn't want to call someone who didn't believe in the Torah with the total title of a rabbi.
Some issues with this book. Isn't this a Chabad book?
So,
finding a few things that are
Rabbi Notik's version.
not equivalent
full
with the
version?
Rabbi. What?
Rabbi Notik's version.
no, in the Rebbe's letter in the back, you have the full letters.
So why did they change it?
So why do they call him Rabbi?
Because again, if you ask a Rav, even a Lubavitch Rav today, he'll give you a heter to do that. So they wanted the people, because if you came to my class last week, you would see.
Sholom, if you look in the foreword, all the people that contributed to this, they're all PhDs. What does that mean? They're mostly secular people.
Yeah, but I don't. The Rebbe wasn't like that. The Rebbe wouldn't make a change to please people, and here we are, JLI, making a change.
In any case, I'm gonna get complaints that I'm campaigning against JLI instead of marketing their wares. So we're gonna move on, and it's not really my parnasa, but it's some people's parnasa.
So here, the
But
rabbi, go ahead.
in text 10, you see what part of Dr. Glazer's argument to the Rebbe in that exchange of letters was, I must disagree with your opinion that there is some intrinsic value to individual Jews involved in the public lighting and blessing of the Chanukiah. I think it might be just the opposite. Ultimately, the survival of Judaism depends on the home, which is where the Chanukiah should be lit. People come into public places to observe, not really participate in the ceremony, are being involved in a kind of public, almost flamboyant religious exercise instead of a sacred home ritual. So he has another complaint, a more within Judaism complaint. He says the menorah has to be done at home, and truthfully, to fulfill the mitzvah, it does have to be done at home. People coming to the Eiffel Tower you have up here to see the menorah, they're just making a show. This show is not good, maybe it's a negative. This is his argument to the Rebbe, and as you know, being devil's advocates, we first support that by saying the difference of the two sets of luchas. So the first luchas, which were given birash, as the Gemara says, did not survive. The second luchas, which were given privately, survived. Those did not get ever broken. So maybe private is more secure, maybe personal and private observance of Yiddishkeit is more enduring than making a lot of noise, which would be a Torah support for Dr. Glazer's complaint.
Well, Chabad is smart. At the public menorah, they give out private little menorahs to people.
That's true.
To do it at home too.
But before we go down to the core issue of is the private of what's more important in Yiddishkeit, the noise or the privacy, and the core issue of his debate, let's just respond with regard to the menorahs. The purpose of the menorah is to publicize the miracle we call Pesumei Nisa. Saying that it should be kept private misunderstands the takana, the institution of the mitzvah of menorah. We're supposed to light them in the window or doorway in order to spread the word out. In fact, originally the menorahs were lit outside. We light them in shul, even though we do it at home again, to spread the word. So in Shalayim they went back to doing it outside the way it originally was, because there's nobody to be afraid of. And this is why we make the Menorah parades and other such displays, because the Menorah was meant to be public. So you might feel that in general, Yiddishkeit should be better celebrated privately, but the Menorah actually is meant to be a public spectacle. So it's a misapplied complaint, shall we say. But let's go further than that. Let's talk about Jewish pride. Why do we want to talk about Jewish pride? Because what's really the issue, and the Rebbe mentions this in his response, what's really bothering these people? Does it bother them that we're taking the religion to the public sphere? Does it bother them that the Yiddishkeit should be kept sacred and at home? Or are they embarrassed when Chabad makes a spectacle of Judaism in public? You know, that the guy that wanted to daven mincha in the airport and he was embarrassed, so he went into this dinosaur age thing called a phone booth. And when they used to still be them. And in the phone booth he picks up the receiver and davens the whole mincha, and he's sure everyone thinks he's having a conversation. He hangs up, he comes out, everyone's staring at him. So what's wrong? He finally notices there's a big sign over the phone booth that says out of order. So Jews have often had a problem with displaying their Yiddishkeit publicly, uncomfortable, and etc. But if you read text 13a, this is Shulchan Aruch. The Rebbe quotes this a lot. The very first seif of the very first section of Shulchan Aruch: be strong as a lion to get up in the morning to serve your Creator, and do not be intimidated by those who mock your service of God. The message being, and we're not going to read all the texts here, but the Rebbe points this out, the first step for Yiddishkeit is not to be intimidated of the guy watching you daven mincha in the airport. And if you let that intimidation get to you, and if you're ashamed of it, Yiddishkeit starts to crumble. So Jewish pride is essential here. And this is really, let's go a step further. Some people view Yiddishkeit as a religion, and therefore they disconnect the private and public life of a Jew. This is why the Haskalah movement, they said, be Jewish at home, and be a Adam, be a regular person outside. Don't parade your Judaism outside. Do all the mitzvahs at home, but be look as like everyone else outside. Disconnect the two. Judaism is a religion. It's not a way of life. It's something that you do and you get on with it. Well, their grandchildren are not Jewish, so they must have been doing something wrong. Judaism is not a religion. Judaism is a way of life. Judaism permeates all aspects of one's being. And when the Menorah is celebrating outdoors and not being ashamed of that is a reminder and a celebration of that principle. If we're going to start to try to hide it, we're separating the two. To again skip some of the text, but there's a very illuminating one. Shall we read here in text 15 from a Reform Rabbi of his description of his Yechidus with the Rebbe, page 275, text 15.
Where are we?
Text 15 on page 275. Herbert Wiener was a novelist and a Reform Rabbi who had a number of Yechidus with the Rebbe, and he wrote an interesting book called 9.5 Mystics where he talks about some of these experiences. I pressed my question from another angle and told him, the Rebbe, that I sensed a desire in Chabad to oversimplify, to strip ideas of their complexity merely for the sake of a superficial clarity. As a matter of fact, I blurted out, all of his Chassidim seem to have one thing in common: a sort of open and naive look in their eyes, that a sympathetic observer might call tmimus, purity, but that might less kindly be interpreted as emptiness or simple-mindedness, the absence of inner struggle. I found myself taken aback by my own boldness, but the Rebbe showed no resentment. He leaned forward. What you see missing from their eyes is a kera. A what? I asked. Yes, a kera, he repeated quietly. A split. The Rebbe hesitated for a moment. I hope you will not take offense, but something tells me you don't sleep well at night, and this is not good for length of days. Perhaps if you had been raised wholly in one world or in another, it might be different. But this split is what comes from trying to live in two worlds. Indeed, I thought, there's no split at Lubavitch. It offers its followers a world in which the mind is never confused by contradictions, where life was not compartmentalized, where the tensions between heart and mind, flesh and soul, God and His creation, were all dissolved in the unity of a higher plan. So he got the point. He understood that purity that he's noticing is a sense of clarity, of being fully subsumed with one Yiddishkeit that permeates our entire lives. Whereas a person like himself, who was actually growing in his Yiddishkeit, is torn between two worlds, where on the one hand he's trying to be very secular and with it, on the other hand he feels a connection. And that contradiction is wrong in Yiddishkeit. The Torah illuminates everything we do down to the way we tie our shoes. And I'm not going to go on some of the final points, although they're interesting in themselves because we're running out of time. But I'll just conclude with an anecdote from, if I may say, even though it's not far back enough, from my childhood. I believe I was in 5th grade in Cheder Lubavitch when our teacher didn't show up one day. And anyone who remembers who that teacher was, he's not teaching anymore. And the next day he came, and he said that he didn't show up yesterday because he was called to jury duty. And he was a very master teacher, shall we say, and he used this as an educational moment. And he told us about his experience at being called for jury duty and actually trying to get out of it. And when he came before the judge, or whoever was interviewing, the individuals, he said that he feels that he's not qualified. And he cannot judge this, totally objectively. So the judge said, why? He says, well, I studied Talmudic law, and this is a criminal case. I think it was even a murder case. And I feel that I'm going to be, judging in my mind according to Talmudic perspective and not follow the accepted American principles. It's not fair. I can't be in this jury. So the judge says, why? I studied Italian law. I still rule according to local law. This just, follow the book. So the teacher asked us, what do you think I answered him? Anybody?
I implemented in who I am. You, it's just out there.
So, very good. I don't know if he actually told this to the judge, but he told us that he did. The point is to say, I live Torah law. I don't study Talmudic law, I live it. It's my life, it's my identity, it's the way I think, it's the way I act in every part of my life. You studied Italian law and maybe 10 other lives because you're brilliant. But I didn't read the Talmud because I'm brilliant. I study the Torah because I live the Torah. And therefore, it's difficult for me to judge somebody on another basis. And it worked because the next day he was back in the classroom. But this is really our message to take home, unless we want to go on for more. But that in Yiddishkeit, it's all of who we are. So we're proud of it and we celebrate the Menorah in the public and on our cars and out there because we're not trying to hide and keep our Yiddishkeit in a certain compartment, but we're trying to live it down to the very details of everything in our life. This concludes with this little video, much shorter than the first one, to highlight the Menorahs throughout the world, kind of like proving the point. Let's get this back to the beginning.
You can be at the Brandenburg Gate, in Red Square, or at Jerusalem's Wall. You can be at the White House, the Eiffel, or defending your ancient homeland. You can be beneath the ocean, or floating above the earth.
Well, this one's real.
Wherever you are, if you are Jewish, this is your flame. It stands tall, and so should you. This Hanukkah, reclaim your flame.
Oh, yeah. It finishes up with the home. The one in the window of the home.
Trying to put it all together.
Thank you very, very much, Rabbi Notik, for coming and sharing with us such a wonderful, interesting thing. I believe there's some contributions down there. Do you mind to pass them up, please?
All right. Thanks for bearing with me all the way through. And if I said anything ridiculous, nobody pointed it out, which was very kind.
Thank you.
You said repudiate.
Well,
we pointed
that
it
was
out.
just a reading issue, and I got clearance because I went to Cheder, so it's not my fault.
Introduce me to your father, Natan.
Mark, this is my father. Mark believes he
Napoleon.
recognizes your name.
Indicating this, but it's been described.
Does he look familiar, Mark?
At some point, the Alter Rebbe had a choice.
Did you ever come to him?
Go with
I've put them on him before. I can try. I'll put
Mistaken.
him. I'll put him.
Okay.
You can go ahead.
You have a good time?
Yeah, thank
Get him the Lubavitch.
Michael,
Dad,
your son is one of our best guys. We love him.
I'm a newcomer. I'm just, getting started.
He's been coming for a
For a
while on
long
and
time,
off.
on and off, that's true.
How about tefillin, Michael? Have you done tefillin yet today?
I don't practice religion at all.
It's not about practicing religion. It's
I
about
like it
practicing.
going.
Let's go put on tefillin.
No, I don't do
You
it.
could do it. Put on tefillin for nothing. Make yourself proud. It's not about practicing religion. It's just about doing the Jewish thing.
The Rebbe
It's gonna be a hard
often pointed out how the United States,
sell, so.
although it's founded on freedom,
Oh,
Yeah, if
I'm
there's
sure
an
you
interesting
Please don't forget to bench, everybody.
Oh yeah.
I almost forgot myself.
You became so holy, you didn't even go there, so.
liberty,
Oh,
wait, I didn't
No, I was taking
terms with no mention of that.
So
In France, when they finished
Yeah, it was
La République
Thank you.
in the United States,
He looks like your father.
they say God was
I'm
wrong.
his father.
So there was always a belief in God, which made
Sholom
it
was
very
my
different to
father's-
society where
father's
Yiddishkeit
name.
could grow. and
Sholom was your
My
grandson?
grandfather.
today. Whereas
It's a nice name.
originally,
Yeah.
I'm named after him too, that's my second name. That was my Hebrew name originally.
lost it,
Shalom.
or emancipated in an
Wow.
I was
atheistic
Nathan,
culture.
and so then I just started being downtown
This
Shalom.
is exactly what
around here?
we discussed.
But you know,
Near O'Hare Airport.
The French Revolution, there was no God.
My wife,
What happened
yeah.
next?
Straight west.
Today, the Rebbe went to France, spent a lot of time there,
Yeah.
and building up the fortitude of believing in
No,
Yiddishkeit,
it's actually
even in that environment.
Chicago limit, but it's called
Today, they're leaving because of anti-Semitism.
Addison
It's
Park.
a different story because they let all the Muslims in.
Yeah, it's really there.
right.
Very nice.
For example, where I used to live,
This is your newest member here, huh?
for whatever reason, must have been more organized.
It's going okay so
So-
far?
If we would allow
Every Jew
the
is a
government
welcome
to
addition.
support any
Very
religion,
Jewish, yeah.
we would have
Right.
this advantage.
What if somebody is
You
not
know, they had this
practicing or doesn't
huge
believe in
school.
Judaism?
They're
What do
still
we?
welcome.
Why does it bother us?
Everyone's
Jewish
welcome.
school?
We've had
We can have our
non-Jews
own.
come here.
Really?
That's the
Who have
idea.
become
No,
Jews.
the
Some of
idea
them,
that-
some of them have not.
Really?
I am exploring.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah,
We have a Bob is not.
we're less organized and
Bob
out
sits
of
in
it
the back,
out,
he
so
has
to
a
speak.
yarmulke, doesn't put a
Then we'll
collar.
get a lot more done.
He considers himself
What is that- why is that Bob?
Noite,
No.
a Noite.
Because eventually
And he
it's going to
comes
go to
and he
Middle Ages.
davens and he verbrands.
And they're gonna
If
overrun
you need
us.
something switched
Yeah,
on,
but
he
is
knows
that
he
because
needs to do
the
it.
government is allowing,
had,
is supporting the
You let
religion,
him do it?
or because
he
they're
has to,
letting Muslims in?
because he's not allowed to keep
Both.
Shabbos. So he has to do
They let Muslims
something.
in and they don't fund
Oh.
their
Oh,
schools
we always
when they're not
turn
at
the
schools.
fan on or the light.
They have them anyway, and they breed
Yeah.
terrorists
But we have
anyway.
less
Yeah, but-
rabbis.
Pretty funny rabbis like, oh, but
Fine, but they breed terrorists without that
Really
support.
nice if someone could.
So,
Hints
meanwhile,
that
in the
it's
past
gone
100, 200 years,
We've had a Paul.
more than
guy
50%
who's
of
become
American
an
Jews are
American
intermarried
Yid.
because they don't go to
We've
Jewish
had
school.
quite a few converts.
Because even when their parents want to send them to
That
Jewish school, they
But
can't
if they
afford it.
would go
Moved
to
to Israel.
Catholic school, they
Yeah,
would
we
definitely
accept-
intermarry
But they're
Catholic.
not meant to go to Catholic school. We want them to go to Jewish
No,
school.
we don't force
But
Right.
the parents in the
Give
1950s
them
said we can't afford a Jewish
It's
school, too
Chabad, they're
expensive.
very open.
Right.
very-
So their children went to public school and then they intermarry.
I'm waiting until
But if
I
the
pay off my
Jewish
dues
school
at
had
Sephardi
funding,
congregation
it
before
would
I
be
can
cheaper.
start
You know,
paying.
Has anyone asked
Then they
you
would go
before?
there and it would be
No,
different
no, no,
today.
They don't
So
ask. They
hundreds
get
of
all-
thousands
yeah,
of
they
Jews
don't
in
ask
America
for money.
would
Some
still be
shows
with
are
us.
like, yeah, you know,
They have to believe.
$36.
They did.
No,
Here they
Two
don't.
generations ago they did. Two
right.
generations ago they
People get
did.
on their
Two
own.
generations ago.
Why did it change? Because they didn't get chinuch, didn't get education in the English.
Because the people who even got the
That
Hindu,
you're more open.
We're more open.
they
and-
did not
yeah.
feel like
They didn't have the
Well, that's kind of
resources
the
to
attitude
continue
of
it
the
strongly.
body.
Chabad in
Hindu
general.
did
Mayor
not
Abbott
speak
had a baby
that.
boy.
Not just this
Wow.
This is a Chabad shul.
And
That's kind of
very kid friendly because we have a children.
Well, not
You know,
I
it didn't
bench
stick
that.
with
I'm
them.
saying
Okay, well maybe that's part of the reason why.
Good to meet you.
Let's go and give it to their children.
Shkoyach, Rabbi.